Hello, Yakri here. If this scene seems familiar, it's because I decided to just straight up start recording my next video right here on unit stats. It's not going to be a very in-depth video. I just want to give you an idea of what everything on this stat screen does, and then show you a little bit about what a stat screen for a commander with magic pathing looks like. So, we're going to go from the top left. Gold cost is fairly obvious, I guess. It's the amount of gold that the unit costs to recruit from your fort or whatever province you might have the unit on. Hit points are how much damage the unit can take before it dies. If you click into hit points, you will see what their basic hit points is, what their current hit points are if they've been damaged or boosted, and the size of the unit. Size is fairly important because one square has 6 size worth of space, which means that you can have 3 size 2 units in it, or 6 size 1 units in it, or 2 size 3 units in it, or only 1 size 4 unit. You can also mix and match sizes, like 1 size 4 unit and 2 size 1 units. This is fairly relevant in combat because when you're attacking in a unit, there's a lot of things that affect a square. I'm going to save talking about that kind of stuff for maybe some kind of combat video where I go into more details about this, but suffice it to say that if you have like a lot of guys with spears or something in a square, that having a bunch of other buddies with you can help you protect yourself, and having a bunch of people in your square to attack another square, especially if it only has like 1 unit in it, gives you an advantage. So small size can be bad. For example, if there's 6 guys in a square and they each cost 10 gold and someone hits that square with a fireball, they're all going to burn to death probably, unless they have a ton of hit points or fire resistance. And then you're going to be out 60 gold worth of units, and that's pretty bad for you. Protection. So protection has a couple different things that go into it, right? You've got body protection and head protection in Dominions. Body protection protects your limbs and your torso. Head protection protects your head, and that's about all. Some creatures do have extra body parts, like hydras. They have multiple heads, and so that changes things a little bit. Your basic protection is how tough and hard your skin is. So humans have no basic protection. You know, we're fleshy meat bags that can be cut apart very easily, whereas let's see, someone else like our pretender god here, the Baconator, has really tough skin, right? He's got 16 protection, tough hide. That's actually I think slightly tougher than stone in the Dominions universe. Earth magic as well provides you an increase to your protection, granting this guy 20 total protection, which makes him quite a badass, I have to say. I'm gonna leave off the special values for the moment. So let's go back to looking at like a Marverny Slinger. Oh wait, no, I was looking at one of these guys. Yes, our glorious Javelineers, but bare-chested warriors. Yes, they're fun. All right, so that's what protection does. Protection. Well, okay, that's what the protection screen looks like. It isn't really what protection does. Protection is damage reduction. If an enemy deals 10 damage to your head and you have 16 head protection, you will take no damage to your head. There are other things that can affect it, like the weapon damage type. You know, blunt does bonus damage to your head. Slashing does bonus damage to limbs. I think maybe it just has bonus damage after armor in general, but mostly that means it's actually not that great. Piercing ignores 20% of armor, which is, I mean, your protection value. So, protection's not that complicated. It's basic armor. All stats in Dominion, when 2 stats compete, there's a roll made. So you can get a kind of a critical effect where, like, protection, I believe protection itself also rolls. Protection rolls low and damage from the enemy rolls high, and you get a value that's actually pretty skewed, and they actually hurt you despite the fact their weapon maybe does 10 damage normally and you have 15 protection. Critical hits are also possible. Actual like exploding D6s are a thing in Dominions. So you have to worry about all those kinds of things. The wider your margin of error is, of course, the less likely you are to actually take damage. If you have 20 protection, someone with a 10 damage sword is very unlikely to hurt you at all. Moving on to magic resist. Effects in Dominions that go against magic resist are kind of like will saves in Dungeons and Dragons, particularly a certain kind of will save that's very common, known as save or suck. If you make the magic resist check, nothing happens to you, but if you fail, usually something really bad happens to you. For example, the spell Soul Slay. If you pass the magic resist check, nothing happens to you. If you fail, you take 999 damage as your soul is ripped out of your body. So, not a lot of fun. People with 10 is kind of the basic amount of magic resist, right? And having more than 10 significantly increases your chance of resisting a magical spell, to the point where around 18, you have like a chance in the high 90s of resisting a normal magic resist spell, negate spell. I think maybe a little bit higher, high 90s is pretty much as high as it goes. And going over 20 becomes kind of ridiculous. Of course, if someone tries enough times, eventually they can get lucky on a roll and kill you. There are also items that change magic penetration values that can allow you to get around magical resist. Now that said, there aren't a lot of effects in Dominions that check against magic resistance. Having a weak magic resistance is something that people can exploit, but it isn't something that just comes up commonly. Your opponent has to actually say like, I know middle-aged Ulm has very weak magic resistance on their troops, so I'm going to cast, say, a Curse of Stones on them, because I know it's going to affect them more than it would most nations. Their units will get encumbered and bogged down and die easily. Next up is morale. Morale is a really important stat, and the morale screen also tells you what the upkeep per year is for your unit. So turns are months, years are 12 turns, and your upkeep cost is 12 turns, I believe it is. Your upkeep cost is done over a year, so it's a little bit confusing to tell what your upkeep is. It's probably a little more useful to look at the actual upkeep you're paying currently as a nation, but if you want to compare the upkeep costs of 2 units directly, you can just take a look here at what their upkeep is. Now, this doesn't give us a lot more information on morale other than, this preamble of like, elite units have very high morale, militia have terrible morale, like this guy. So morale is really important because I think there are a variety of things that cause morale checks, and I kind of want to make a video just on morale and take some time to research it, because honestly, I don't remember all the different specific circumstances under which you can get a morale check. Typically, it happens if your squad takes a lot of damage suddenly, or if it's depleted beyond like half its life, or I think there's like certain breakpoints, like 75% of its total hit points of the squad, and like 50%, something like that. And if your army loses too many units, the whole army will make a morale check and potentially can rout. And routing is really bad in Dominions. If your units decide that they're going to flee, they abandon all attempts at fighting and just run away while their enemies hack them down from behind. Typically, this results in a huge amount of your units dying, and it can be very frustrating sometimes because it's possible for an unlucky morale check to massively swing the tide of battle when perhaps you would have been winning before then. Now, moving on to resources. Pretty simple. That's how many resources it costs to train the unit. Resources are a product of your unit's basic resource cost, which is done by race, and your unit's equipment resource cost, right? Like this is this equipment down here, and each of these things has a resource cost. And the resource costs of these things are added together and added to his basic resource cost, which for a human is 1, and you get our total resource cost of 9. Strength is how strong a unit is. Strength is added to the damage of most weapons, like javelins and broadswords that this guy has. And 10 is normal for a human soldier. There are units that have more than 10, like this guy, 11. Like he's a trained soldier that works out. And I think, somewhere, maybe it's Ulm, humans have some soldiers that have 12 strength. And that's like quite a badass. Like your sacred blessed guys, even, oh no, these are the noble warriors, your boar warriors, they have 12 strength. These guys are actually mystical and they can get blessing from your god. And they berserk, which actually brings up your strength even more to 16, I believe. So let's go back to these guys. Your strength is fairly simple. It determines a few things like how far you can throw a javelin and how much damage you deal and how much your value you have in a siege, and that's about all. So attack skill is your odds of hitting an opponent. If you have attack skill 10 and your opponent has attack skill or defense skill 10, you have, I believe, about a 50% chance of hitting them. Deviating significantly, like if someone has like 14 defense skill and you have 10 attack skill, it's pretty unlikely that you're going to be able to hit them. Now, defense is somewhat this seeming disparity where like if a unit has a lot of defense, it should be able to just be almost invulnerable, right? If it's very hard to hit a unit with 14 defense like this guy has if you have only 10 attack. Well, there's a couple things that you don't really see often about the defense skill. So looking here, his basic defense skill is only 10, and his weapon gives him a bonus of +1. But his armor and shield give him a bonus of -1. However, he has shield parry of 4. So what's this mean? Well, if an attack rolls a 10 to hit this guy, it completely misses. If an attack rolls an 11 to hit this guy, it gets past his basic defense skill after his weapon and shield modifiers, and it hits his shield because his shield parry bonus is +4, right? So if his basic defense is 10 after modifiers and his shield parry is 4, it means that from 11 to 14, right, the value of that shield parry modifier, that's the range in which a blow hits his shield instead of him. And if we look on his shield, it has protection, so this is short for protection 16. So then the damage of the attack is reduced by the protection value of the shield. And if it would do, say, 20 damage, he will still take 4 damage through his shield on an attack roll of 11. So it's not that amazing to have 14 defense skill in this situation. There are some elf troops that have, say, 18 defense skill where they have a +4 shield bonus, and that's quite good, especially since some of them are sacreds and you water bless them and you get like, 22 defense where their basic defense where they're missed completely is actually like 18, and then they have armor, right? So like if this guy doesn't wear any armor, right? Besides, he just has an iron excuse me. He just has an iron cap and a shield. So actually, if something hits his shield, he kind of wants it to hit his head after that because his iron cap will probably block the rest of the damage. If he was wearing armor and someone hit him in the torso, but it actually hit the shield instead, you would add the protection values together of his torso armor and his shield and check your damage against that, in which case, for most units that have shields, you're very unlikely to deal much damage to them if you hit their shield. These guys in particular, you actually have a fairly good chance of hurting them through their shields, though. But that's the nature of such a lightly armored and cheap unit. Precision is your odds of hitting the square you aim for with a missile weapon. Having low precision doesn't necessarily make a unit useless at firing missile weapons. It makes them more useless the farther away from their target they are, but in general, if you're firing against or at a huge army with a ton of troops, it's possible that you can miss your target and hit another square that has units inside of it. And if that happens, there's a chance for you to hit a unit in that square. It's not really any different, to the best of my knowledge, from hitting the square you're actually aiming for. So it's more or less the scatter roll for your ranged weapons, right? The one time where you might want a really high precision... The one time you might want a really high precision value is if you're having to deal with thugs or super combatants, big single units that you need to bring down in like a burst of damage to kill them. Well, if you fired 50 crossbows at one of those guys, they might not actually do very much because only 1 or 2 crossbow bolts might hit. But what if we were able to buff those crossbows to precision very high, up to like 15 or something crazy? That's actually crazy high for precision. And then they fired when the unit was very close because the scatter becomes larger the farther away from your target is from you. Then they might hit with 30 of those bolts. That's very likely to kill most things, actually. It's a huge amount of damage. So bear that in mind. Encumbrance, what Encumbrance does is anytime you do something in battle, you're going to be affected by one of these encumbrance values, right? The melee encumbrance is means that if I swing my sword to attack some guy, I'm going to generate 4 fatigue, right? Because wearing heavy armor and swinging my sword is wearing me out. I believe the basic encumbrance for this guy, because he's a human, is 3. So even if I was totally butt naked, I would be swinging my sword, and it's still kind of wearing me out a bit. He's got a helmet and a shield, and I'm not sure which one of them is adding to this encumbrance value, but one of them is. And so carrying that around, that's wearing him out more while he's swinging his sword. Now, if you were to cast spells, any encumbrance added by armor is doubled. So putting spellcasters in heavy armor is bad. It's kind of the explanation for why most spellcasters have robes. You know, they wear robes, and old spellcasters are bad because being old encumbers you. You know, it makes you tired and fatigued. So that's a very important aspect of combat. When units build up a lot of fatigue, which is this here, that's generated by your encumbrance, it creates a lot of penalties. I think this is actually... Yeah, this actually explains what goes on with fatigue, right? The more fatigued you are, I think it's like every 20 fatigue or so, your defense skill decreases, making it easier for units to hit you. At 50 fatigue, there's a chance for a attacker to hit a weak point in your armor and ignore half the value of your armor when they're rolling their damage. And if your fatigue goes above 100, you fall unconscious and you can't attack, you can't defend yourself. Your armor doesn't really work, and you're probably going to die at that point. There's very little chance of you surviving this. So, you know, having your units fatigue out is pretty bad, and there are various magical effects that will add fatigue. Few of them will just straight up cause your units to pass out and then immediately die, but they're... You know, one of the advantages of having a guy like this that's not wearing a lot of armor and has only encumbrance 4 is that those effects are going to be less effective against this guy. Well, what if I have a guy who's got like encumbrance 8 and he's generating 8 fatigue every time he attacks, and then also someone's slamming him for an extra 20 fatigue or so? That's much more effective than some guy who over the 2 rounds has only generated 4 fatigue versus 16. All right, let's look at equipment. There's not too much to discuss here. This is a fairly good unit to take a look at, though, because he's got ranged weapons and a sword. So if you look at the weapon, there's a few different stats on it, right? Length is important because of the repel mechanic. If you look at the description and the tooltip, when an enemy attacks you, with their weapon, right? If your weapon is longer than theirs, they have to make a morale check. And if they fail that morale check, you will not successfully... if they fail that morale check, they won't successfully attack you. So having a pike of length 6, right, is really good because you get a morale check against almost every weapon in the game, or they have to make a repel check against you for almost every weapon in the game to attack you. And the bigger the difference in length of your weapon, the harder the check is, right? So if the difference is 4 because they've got a length 2 broadsword like this guy and you have a length 6 pike, you have a pretty big bonus to not get attacked by this guy in the first place. And then you still have to defeat your, defense value and your protection to actually deal damage. And if there are multiple units in a square with these longer weapons, then every unit in that square gets a repel check. So if I have 3 pikemen in a square, I get 3 repel checks at that length 4 bonus versus this long broadsword, and you have to beat all 3 in order to hit one of these pikemen. So that's something really important to keep in mind. It's a lot of why you want to use like javelineers who have spears with length 4, 2 length longer than these guys, versus independents, because a lot of independents will have length 2 weapons and you'll get morale check or repel checks against them, and a lot of independents will have length 4 spears and you won't have to get repel checks against them because your weapons are the same length, and you get the benefit of still throwing javelins, which is great. Okay, so let's go back to bare-chested warriors, yeah. And then we have our armor. Armor is kind of self-explanatory. There's how much encumbrance it adds. There's the penalty to your defense skill, if any. With our shield, we have our penalty to defense skill, parry bonus, and encumbrance, as well as the protection value of the shield. And yes, there's something I kind of forgot for some reason here, which is the attack and damage values of weapons. Also the length value on a ranged weapon, right? This is the range in a straight line in squares of a ranged weapon. They kind of have to, if you ever tried to learn chess and people tell you, well, knights move in L shapes, right? You have to kind of draw a line forward, what is it, 2 squares? Or is it 3 squares? I'm not very good at chess. Let's say 2 squares and then 1 square to the left or right. And that will tell you where you can move with a knight, right? Well, if I wanted to attack 8 squares up and 2 squares to the left, I would be able to do that with a javelin as drawn in a straight line 8 squares up and then straight line to the left 2 squares. I could attack there, right? Because that's 10 squares away the way Dominions draws the ranges of ranged weapons. So that's something important to remember. Typically, you want to be able to attack straight forward with your ranged weapons. Firing diagonally is very ineffective and reduces your range a lot. There is, of course, no repel value with ranged weapons. So attack is your chance to hit. The attack value for ranged weapons is the precision value. Javelins have a penalty to precision, so they kind of tend to fly everywhere. This guy's not too bad with 10 being modified to 8 precision. There are some units that actually have less than 10. They'll get modified down to like 7 or something. And then this is the damage type. These little symbols here. This is slashing and piercing, and this one is piercing. And these are the damage values of your weapons. We've already talked about how damage works against protection. That kind of gives you an idea of what these actually mean, right? Versus a guy like this, you could easily deal like 13 damage with his own weapon, and that would kill him in 1 hit. So these are very squishy units. You mostly would hire a whole crap ton of them and have them go up against either units that are like so tough that they could easily kill one of your badass units in a single hit. So if they're killing some chump like this guy in 1 hit, who cares? Or that kind of thing. Oops, I kind of went off the script of talking about stats a little bit there. There is one thing I seem to have forgotten about: movement. Right, so see this 2/11? Well, the first number is their map move speed. That's how many provinces they can move in 1 turn. And the second number is their action points. I think it makes 2 action points to move a square in combat. So that's how fast they're going to be when running around in combat. As it says here, you can no longer act in a turn once you've used up your AP. You can only attack once each. Yeah, it consumes all your AP, but you could have like 1 point of AP left after moving, and then you could attack after moving. So these guys are fairly fast because they're light infantry. As you can see, these guys are slower, and then something like your Epony Knights are quite fast. 3 map move, 23 movement speed. You'll just zip across the battlefield with these guys. Let's see. I'm not sure now if I mentioned that when someone attacks a unit, right, it gives them a -2 penalty to their defense skill for having been attacked once already that turn. So if 3 people attack the same unit, it will get a -6 penalty to defense. That's pretty significant. It increases your odds of hitting them with that final attack significantly. Of course, it's even worse if there are more than 3 units teamed up on someone. You can easily get down to 0 defense to where you're being hit automatically every single time without fail. Mounted units get a special bonus, actually, where the penalty is only -1 per attack for a mounted unit. So they deal a little bit better with being surrounded, but they're also a larger size category, so they get surrounded more easily. It's a little bit of a 50-50 split. But that's something to keep in mind, and it also kind of lets you understand why units with multiple attacks are very good. Because even if you're facing some, pompous elf sitting up on his high horse with his like 22 defense, and he's mounted, so he's resistant to being attacked repeatedly in a turn, and you have a unit with, say, a bite attack and a sword attack, like you're riding a tiger. So if you are size, say, 2, right? I think tiger riders are not size 2, but there are other things that might be, human-sized. I think lizards are human-sized and have 2 attacks per round. Or if you're a human who's dual-wielding swords, there could be 3 of you in a square, attacking for a total of 6 times per round, meaning that eventually, you're going to have a -6 penalty to that archer or that horseman's defense. And Possibly you could even surround them with more units, actually, if you get units on their side too. And that's how you can bring down like super tough super combatants that are like armored to the gills and have really high defense. It's not as relevant, of course, if they don't have high defense, but even then, getting their defense down with a lot of attacks to ensure that every single attack hits means you're going to get more opportunities for critical strikes that can actually win you a battle like that. So I think that's all for... Oh, shoot. That's not all for unit stats. I almost forgot. Let's take a look at our pretender here, the thrice-horned boar. And we're also going to go over some commander unique things here. All right, so there are a couple things that I completely neglected, or almost completely neglected. That's leadership right here. This is very simple. It's how many units you can lead. If you click into it, it tells you the different types of units you can lead. It tells you how much your squad morale bonus is and how many squads you can lead. After leadership 40, every additional 40 leadership you have, so like 80 or 120, you start getting morale bonuses. So morale bonuses of +1 go to all your squads at 80, and at 120 all your squads get +2, and so on and so forth. I don't think normally almost any units have more than 80 leadership or 120 leadership, but 120 leadership units are around. 80 leadership units are semi-common. Down here, you have special abilities that a unit may have, like magic paths that you can check up on, research ability from their magic paths, poison resistance, being a pretender god, trampling, berserker, forest survival, recuperation. All these different stats go down here. Finally, this guy's kind of a bad example, but let's take a look at this dude. He's some hero I got when I was doing my earlier video. Now, he has all these slots. This is essentially his inventory. He can hold magic gems, and he can hold a magic item in each of these slots. There isn't really much more else to know about that. It's just his torso slot can wear armor, you can hold weapons, and various powerful magical items. But I wanted to point that out. Okay, now we're done. We have discussed the unit stat screen in its entirety and talked about unit stats quite a bit. Hopefully, this has been helpful to you and will make it easier to understand some of my later videos.